At its most basic, a definition for depth of field might be everything that's in focus besides what's in focus. So if you look at these two images here, in the picture on the left, you can clearly see that the young lady is in focus, and you can clearly see that the background is in focus. So both the young lady and the background are sharp. This is called a large depth of field, or a wide, a deep depth of field. There's a lot of depth of field going on here because both the foreground and the background are in focus. If you compare that to the image of the right, the woman is in focus, but the background is soft. So the right-hand image has a very shallow depth of field. It has very little depth of field. Let's look at another one. This is basically the same concept. If you look at the image on the left, it has a very shallow depth of field. The young lady is in focus. The background is not sharp. The tree is not sharp. If you look at the image on the right, everything is sharp. The young lady's in focus, the background is in focus, you can clearly see individual leaves. That's a large depth of field, or a deep depth of field. Controlling your depth of field allows you to set up shots so that you can make this choice. Is it important to include the background? Maybe the background's a distraction. Maybe you want to do a rack focus later on. There are three ways in which we can control depth of field. We can do it working with our zoom, we can do it working with the distance between the camera and the subject, and we can do it with the aperture. And that's roughly the order in which they're from easiest to most difficult. So let's take a look at the first one. Controlling depth of field using your zoom. So take a look at this image of Buzz Lightyear. What I have done here, there are 4 Buzz Lightyears on the table, but I have zoomed all the way in. The camera's at its maximum most telephoto setting. You can clearly see the one in the front is focused, and the Buzz Lightyear over his shoulder, which is only a few inches away, is not in focus. This is nice because it allows me to do a rack focus like this. Now watch what happens as I zoom out. Not only is the image getting wider so we can see more of the scene, more of what's going on, but notice that the Buzz Lightyear in the background is now in focus as well. As I zoomed out, that depth of field increased. So let's take a look at a graphic representation of that. Here is our depth of field when the camera was zoomed all the way in. The zoom is indicated by the blue triangle there, the depth of field by the little yellow bar. And you can see that only one of the images, only one of the Buzz Lightyears would be in focus, even if we could see all 4. As I zoom out, as that field of view gets wider and wider, so too does the depth of field get wider and wider, until all 4 of the Buzz Lightyears, not only are they in the shot, but they're all 4 in focus. As you zoom in, as you use a telephoto lens, your depth of field gets smaller. As you zoom out, as you use a wide-angle lens, your depth of field gets greater. Let's talk about how to use distance to control our depth of field. Now here we have the same setup. We have 4 Buzz Lightyears on a table, and what I've done here is I have moved the camera very close. And you can see, again, the Buzz Lightyear in front is in focus. The Buzz Lightyear you can see over his shoulder is not in focus. Rather than zooming, what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to physically move the camera farther away. Now notice, now that I'm set up, all 4 Buzz Lightyears are in focus. I haven't changed the zoom. All I've done is I physically moved the camera farther away, and then of course I had to focus again. But this was done simply by changing the distance. So the closer your camera is to your subject, the less depth of field you will have. The farther your camera is from your subject, the more depth of field you will have. Those are the easy 2. Using your aperture to control depth of field is noticeably more difficult, but this is the way you want to do it. This is going to let you set up your shots so that you control whether or not you can do a rack focus. You can control whether or not your foreground and your background are both in focus at the same time. As you open your iris, your depth of field will decrease. So the wider open your iris is, the closer you get down to f1.4, the less depth of field you have. As you close your iris, the greater the depth of field becomes. So as you get down to f11 and f16, you really have a lot more depth of field. Of course, if you're moving your iris, opening and closing your iris, you're going to have to compensate because your exposure is going to get changed, right? So you're going to have to manipulate your shutter speed and or your neutral density and or your gain to make up for the fact that you're changing the iris around. But it's totally worth it. Look at this image. Really look at it. On the left-hand side, the picture was taken with an iris of f1.4. And the only thing that's in focus is the child. The rest of these images are the same image, right? You haven't zoomed in or out, you have not moved the camera closer or farther away, but you can tell that the depth of field is changing because the iris is changing. So by the time you get to the right-hand side there to f16, not only is the child in focus, everything in that picture is in focus. The water in between you and the child is in focus, the background is in focus, the leaves are sharp, even on the distant ones in the shadows there. Everything at f16 is in focus, whereas almost nothing at f1.4 was in focus, only the kid. And you can see, as you're closing the iris down to 2.8 to 5.6 to 11, how that depth of field is growing steadily more and more and more. Let's take a look at this shot that I set up outside. In the foreground we have Father Chaminade, and in the background we have the sign for the Sullivan Family Library. In this initial shot, I set it up so that the depth of field was very shallow. This allows me to do a rack focus if I want to. Let's see how that works out. Here's the same shot. I didn't zoom in or out. I didn't move the camera closer or farther. All I did was I changed the exposure so I could change the f-stop. And look at how much more depth of field I've got now. Both the statue and the sign are in focus. So let's take a look at that graphically. The Father Chaminade statue was about 16 feet away from me, and the library wall was about 40 feet away from me. So when I set the exposure up the first time, I had the iris very wide open, probably around f4, and I had a very shallow depth of field. The only thing that was sharp was the statue. When I took the second shot, I closed the iris all the way down to f16, maybe even f22, so that the depth of field was greatly increased, and both the statue and the sign that were 30 feet farther away were in focus. Let's do another example with Buzz Lightyear. Here I have 4 Buzz Lightyears stretched out on a table, and you can see that I have set it up in such a way that my depth of field is very shallow. I can only have one face of one Buzz Lightyear in focus at a time. Now this is nice because it lets me do a rack focus. I can go in either direction and focus on whichever single Buzz I want to call attention to. Let's take a look at some of that. This might be good if it was a crowd scene where we don't know who in the crowd is supposed to be the bad guy, right? But by some clever manipulation of our composition here, we've called attention to the person that we're supposed to be paying attention to. We know which one is actually the Buzz Lightyear we're looking for. Now here's the same shot with a much larger depth of field, so that all 4 Buzz Lightyears are in focus. This just shows an ensemble. Maybe it's important that we have 4 Buzz Lightyears on the same team. I did not zoom in or out. I did not move the camera closer or farther. The only thing I did was I changed my aperture. I closed down from f4 down to f16 or so. And of course I had to make adjustments to keep the image from being underexposed. But this is the same framing, the same composition, with a much wider depth of field. So again, let's take a look at that graphically. So my camera was about 9 feet from the closest Buzz Lightyear, and the Buzz Lightyears were spread out on a tabletop over a distance of about 3 feet total. So in that first image, where we only had 1 Buzz Lightyear at a time in focus, you can see the depth of field is really quite narrow. And it was only, maybe an inch, inch and a half wide. It was barely wide enough to get his entire face in, not much more than that. By changing the exposure, by closing the iris down, I was able to get the depth of field wide enough that all 4 Buzz Lightyears fit inside the range of focus there. So here's a nice breakdown, and this is the sort of chart that you're going to see on exams, and this is definitely something you should understand. The whole reason that we drill so hard on exposures, on making equivalent exposures, is so that you can do this, right? If you have a perfect exposure at f4, 1/60th of a second, you're at ISO 800 with no neutral density, and you want more depth of field. But you want more depth of field without changing your shot. You don't want to zoom out. You don't want to move the camera. It looks the way you want it to look, but it just needs more depth of field. Now you know how to do that, right? You start to close your iris down. And as you close your iris down, you have to compensate for that because you begin to underexpose the picture. So you either have to slow your shutter speed down or start adding gain. This is why we drill with those numbers so often. Look at this, remember it. As you zoom out, you get more depth of field. As you move the camera away, you get more depth of field. As you close the aperture, you get more depth of field. As you zoom in, you get less depth of field. As you move the camera closer, you get less depth of field. And as you open the iris, you get less depth of field. Pretty much just have to memorize this, but it's something that you do need to understand. All right, so depth of field and controlling depth of field is about the most complicated thing that we do here. It means that you have to understand how to manipulate your exposure and how to balance your exposure. And you have to think about this when you're setting the shot up. If you're planning to do a rack focus, you know you have to construct your shot in such a way that you can have that shallow depth of field. So think about that when you're planning, how close is my camera going to be to my subject? How zoomed in do I want to be? Likewise, if you're trying to do something that has a very deep depth of field, right? You want to see the person sitting under the palm tree, but you also want to see the people playing on the beach 50 yards away. You're going to have to think through how to make that happen to get the depth of field that you need. And if you need to go back and forth between the two, maybe you have a sadistic professor who makes it a shooting assignment. Well, now you understand why I make you do such things, right? If you've made it this far, you are doing great. We have concepts still to go. We have lots of concepts still to go. But the idea of balancing an exposure and the idea of using that exposure to control your depth of field are definitely the two most complicated things that we do all semester long. So from here on, it's a smooth downhill ride. Lots of new stuff to learn, but you won't stretch your brain quite so much.